Our first speaker is Professor Karima Bennoune. Karima and I met, I think, last time we were together was in Korea, in Jeju, at the United Cities and Local Governments Culture Summit. But Karima is the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And she's been doing amazing work in that post around the world, addressing the right to culture and the issue of cultural rights. I can make a plug for Karima's Twitter feed, which is among the good ways to find out what she's been up to around the world with her UN remit. And I think it's a fitting transition from the opening segment that we had to Karima's perspective on the question.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, all of the sponsoring organizations behind the Climate Heritage Mobilization, and the individual organizers of this event for their hard work to focus our attention on the impact of climate change on the human right to access and enjoy cultural heritage, amongst all the other important human rights impacts to be addressed here in San Francisco this week. And I thank the organizers in particular for inviting me to take part. Because I really salute and endorse this necessary endeavor, and it's a true honor to be a part of it. In the summit this week in San Francisco, we are coming together to face critical responsibilities as human beings and as human-created institutions for nothing less than the preservation of human life as we know it, including human cultures, in the face of climate change. As Navi Pillai, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said, climate change is one of the most serious challenges humanity has ever faced. My primary messages in the short time that I have this morning are two. The first is that the impact of climate change on cultural heritage is, above all else, a question of human rights, and it needs to be understood and responded to as such. And the second key message is that cultural heritage is not only a potential victim of climate change, but it is also an important resource to prevent and address the challenges caused by this phenomenon in a human rights respecting manner. I entirely support the call of my former colleague, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, for international recognition, similar to that in regional instruments, of the human right to a healthy environment. He has further explained, as you see here, that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. Without such an environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations or even live at a level commensurate with minimum standards of human dignity. And as I myself will explain in a report to the General Assembly on universality and cultural diversity this coming October, the universality of human rights, including the cultural rights I work on, has no meaning today without a livable environment in which they can be enjoyed. Climate change specifically is also a human rights issue, as Professor Knox has explained in a crucial 2016 report for the Human Rights Council, and that's a report I really recommend to you. Climate change has particular impacts on the human rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and a number of other groups. It often, in fact, has the most drastic effect on the human rights of those who have done the least to contribute to the problem in the first place. Today we focus on this critical intersection between two key human rights issues then, climate change and human rights. The intentional destruction of cultural heritage was the first theme I chose to focus on when I became the Special Rapporteur in November 2015. And I've been determined to take a holistic approach to this issue, looking at situations of war and peace, looking at the actions of state and non-state actors, looking at impacts on tangible and intangible heritage, considering well-publicized attacks but also less well-known events, such as the terrible histories of destruction of the cultural heritage of many indigenous peoples around the world. Climate change today is amongst the greatest threats to cultural heritage, and we must act with determination to respond to this threat. If the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council have taken action to respond to intentional destruction of cultural heritage, including by terrorist groups, and I'm so pleased that they have, but if they have done this, they should likewise act to respond to the threat that climate change now poses to cultural heritage. As noted in an excellent 2014 monograph entitled Climate Change as a Threat to Peace, Impacts on Cultural Heritage and Cultural Diversity, there are a myriad of ongoing and potential impacts. For example, cultural heritage sites face threats from temperature changes, flooding, storms. Natural heritage sites face developments such as glaciers melting and habitat changes. In addition, as this monograph warns, climate change is likely to affect cultural diversity and sociocultural interactions by forcing communities to change their work habits and ways of life, to compete for resources, or to migrate elsewhere. I am greatly alarmed by many studies I was going to cite, but given the shortness of time, I will mention just one 2014 academic study which found that more than 130 World Heritage cultural sites are at long-term risk from sea level rise. And I think this is a very low estimate, but nevertheless very important examples. The sites under threat in this study include the archaeological site of Carthage in Tunisia and India's Elephanta caves. Moreover, we know that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means it magnifies existing threats to cultural heritage, such as fueling conflicts in which heritage destruction may take place. Many people might ask why we should care about the specific issue of the impact of cultural heritage, the impact on cultural heritage, when there are so many other threats posed to human beings and human rights by climate change. And I think the only way to offer a convincing answer to this question is through a human rights approach to cultural heritage. Viewed from a human rights perspective, heritage is important in and of itself, but also in relation to its human dimension, including as an expression of human dignity. The right of access to and enjoyment of cultural heritage forms part of international human rights law, finding its legal basis, amongst other sources, in the right to take part in cultural life, guaranteed both by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 70th anniversary of which we celebrate this year, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a binding treaty which has 169 state parties in every region of the world. Cultural heritage is a fundamental resource for other human rights also, in particular the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, access to history and a diversity of scientific knowledge as part of the right to education, as well as the economic rights of the many people who earn a living through tourism related to such heritage, and indeed the right to development. It is impossible to separate a people's cultural heritage from the people itself and that people's rights. This is nowhere more evident than in the connection between the destruction of cultural heritage and the destruction of lives, livelihoods, and land. Climate change is having and will continue to have a grave impact on the cultural heritage of all humankind, and hence on the related human rights of millions of human beings. This reality has not been adequately acknowledged in current climate change initiatives. It must be recognized as a matter of international legal obligation and addressed as a priority. In addition, a human rights-based approach requires paying attention to the disparate impact of climate change, which magnifies and is magnified by underlying inequalities. For example, it implies taking a gender-sensitive approach to the protection of cultural heritage, including by recognizing the work of women defenders of cultural heritage and including them in climate processes. Climate change-induced damage and destruction of cultural heritage can have particularly significant effects on indigenous peoples. A human rights-based approach encourages climate change measures and initiatives that recognize and value indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and land care, and also that of other groups of people who work with the land in close interaction with the forest or the water, and who have developed modes of production that are more respectful of the environment and do not contribute to climate change. Another vital aspect of the human rights approach is the emphasis on participation and consultation of affected people, especially those most affected, with regard to policies and responses. It also requires the full involvement of and support for human rights defenders on the front lines who are striving, sometimes at risk of their lives, like Berta Cáceres, to protect human rights and cultural heritage, including from the negative effects of climate change. As the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights explained in a 2009 study, the application of a human rights approach in preventing and responding to the effects of climate change serves to empower individuals and groups who should be perceived as active agents of change and not as passive victims. And I think that is a critical aspect, indeed, of the human rights approach. As I firmly believe, inspired by the motto of the Afghan National Museum, which you see here, a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. I should say, in my view, its cultures stay alive. The damage and destruction of cultural heritage, when those most closely connected to it are suffering from other severe impacts of climate change, also takes away a key cultural resource that can build resilience and help those people to cope at the very moment when they need such resources the most. I am deeply concerned about the fact that some recent prominent studies of climate heritage have not addressed the human rights implications and have not employed a human rights approach. This is a mistake, and this is a gap which must be filled. As I run out of time, let me say I have spent a great deal of time, both before and since I became Special Rapporteur, listening to women and men talk about the pain and suffering, physical and mental, caused to them and their families by the destruction of cultural heritage to which they have connections. It is critical to listen to their voices and to understand that it is no mere theoretical construct to say that cultural heritage is a human rights issue. This is a lived reality for diverse people around the world. If, as the UN Secretary General has warned this week, governments do not take effective action by 2020 to deal with climate change, we may indeed, as he suggests, be facing a runaway train which will be difficult to stop. And we must consider the human rights impacts, including the cultural rights impacts of this potential runaway train. They will be nothing short of devastating, and the time for action is now. I have a few specific recommendations. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of them, but in particular, I want to encourage you to consider submitting cases concerning climate heritage to my mandate, to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so that we can raise these with governments and further build the human rights jurisprudence in this area. I think that is incredibly important. Placido Domingo once said that cultural heritage is the face of hope. I think this is absolutely true, and I hope that we will come together in hope to protect culture, to protect cultural heritage in the face of climate change, to protect it in all its diversities, and in particular to protect the indispensable ways in which it enables human beings of all kinds to enjoy their internationally guaranteed fundamental human rights. Our work together has only just begun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karima.